I think, American workers and the whole economy is going to grow in a way that we haven't seen it grow in a long time. This is the time for us to move. So today, the U.S. has the highest economic growth rate, leading the world economies. What you're seeing is enormous growth in the country. Even with the pandemic, we've generated a record job creation, a record economic growth in this country.
What can you do to prevent a recession?
Continue to grow the economy. And we're growing the economy. It's growing in a way that it hasn't in years and years.
This guy. Joining us now, Phillip. He is the precious metal specialist at Birch Gold Group. Phillip, thank you so much for joining us. So over the course of this hour, we've listened to Joe Biden say that Bidenomics is doing so well, the median consumer, investor, home purchaser, and so forth, that they're all flourishing. Is Bidenomics actually succeeding? Is the median American economically better off right now than they were 4 years ago?
Well, I think that is a very good question. Look, if you cherry pick numbers, you can make an argument for growth, but I think it's a mistake to just focus on economic growth. Look at GDP, for example, right? It's an abstraction. It's just one way to measure overall productivity. And things like high inflation that we've been feeling for the last few years really can skew those numbers. So I think the question that you posed is a better one, right? Is the average American doing better today? Right? We should focus on not whether Bidenomics is working, but whether it's working for the individual. I think that's the question that really matters. Are we better off than we were before the pandemic? And I think the short answer to that is no.
And if you had to pinpoint or if you had to choose really one or maybe two reasons as to why you feel confident that the answer is no, what would you choose? I mean, we have inflation, we have soaring national deficits, we have foreign policy chaos around the world. What do you think are the most glaring economic problems facing the median American right now?
Look, I think you mentioned a lot of them right there. But if we look at the last 2.5 years, I think the numbers tell a very clear story for the average American household. Food at home is up 20%. Electricity prices up 21%. Gasoline prices are up 72%. Now let's look at housing, which is obviously most people's biggest expense. Rent payments rose 25%. Median mortgage payments are up 85%. In January of 2021, a $3,000 monthly budget would buy you a $640,000 home. Today, that same budget buys a $434,000 home. That's a 32% reduction in purchasing power thanks to higher mortgage rates as well as higher prices, which leads me to the next point. Home prices themselves are up 30% since January of 2021. Now, very importantly, because this is where people feel the pain, wage growth has trailed inflation consistently. The average household's purchasing power has taken a $6,000 a year pay cut. In other words, it's not our imagination. Virtually every essential is significantly more expensive today. And because wages haven't kept up, consumer debt has recently hit an all-time high, over $1 trillion in credit card balances today. Basically, people are desperately trying to maintain their standards of living in the face of Bidenomics. Now, we could call that economic growth, or you could call it taking on more debt to make ends meet. Inflation today is making that almost impossible. So I think if you start to delve into the numbers, we start to see the real story.
Yeah, inflation has, of course, been a leitmotif of this hour-long special. And from my perspective, it continues to be one of the most debilitating issues facing the median American consumer, investor, home purchaser, perhaps above all. Inflation is supposed to be the bailiwick, Phillip. It's supposed to be the bailiwick of central bankers and the Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve recently had their annual meeting out in Jackson Hole, Wyoming. Do you trust Fed Chair Jerome Powell and the current Board of Governors to get inflation under control? I mean, admittedly, the number has come down a little bit from its 40-year high that it reached last summer, but it continues to be well above the 2% target that the Federal Reserve explicitly prescribes. Do you have any faith that they are prepared to do what it takes to get that number down further, or are are you still skeptical of that?
So first of all, a couple of points there. Number one, inflation or headline inflation is been coming down, but core inflation, which is everything outside of food and energy, has been proving particularly sticky. It's been flat for over a year. So what that tells us, the only meaningful reduction we're seeing is either in food prices or energy prices. Well, guess what? Food prices are up significantly. So the only meaningful reduction we're seeing is in energy prices, and they're on the rise again. Oil hit $90 a barrel a couple of days ago. So it's pretty clear that the Fed haven't really got a handle on inflation. In terms of Powell's ability to deal with it, look, I think the Jackson Hole meeting was really telling. The one takeaway I had from this 3-day meeting is just perplexity. It's clear central bankers around the world are struggling to understand the current climate. Powell said it himself. He said central bankers were navigating by the stars under cloudy skies. Christine Lagarde, who's obviously the European Central Bank president, said there is no historical precedent for today's woes. She can't understand why in a climate where interest rates are going up, employment is still high. So I think central bankers around the world are really struggling. The problem with Powell for me is not so much a desire to fix the issues or the will to fix the issues, but rather the tools to fix the issues, right? He's very limited in terms of what he can do at the moment. So for example, if they want to stimulate growth in the economy, what have they got to do? They've got to lower rates and pump money through the economy, which they cannot do because it fuels the inflationary climate. So instead, they've got to raise the interest rate. But we're seeing problems there. Look at the squeeze it put on the banking system earlier in the year. Look at the amount of national debt we have. If rates got too high, it could be crippling. So I think the tools available to the Federal Reserve right now are quite limited. And for that reason, I think inflation may be higher for longer, as Powell has been suggesting. And I think the 2% target may be a pipe dream for the foreseeable future.
Well, not a particularly optimistic message, albeit a very sober and realistic one. So, Phillip, finally, at a time like this, where inflation shows really no signs of getting down to anything remotely resembling an average or acceptable rate, people have to look for a hedge in their portfolio somewhere. Gold is an obvious place to go. It has been for centuries and centuries. So, why don't you give your take on why gold, above all, right now, this is the time to get invested in gold?
Look, I think that it is simply because of the nature of our problems, right? Gold over long periods of time is about preservation of wealth, preservation of buying power. It's a steady Eddie approach. But in tough times, it can perform very well. And really what drives gold are the problems that we have, right? For those that are worried about recession, gold can function as a very good hedge, right? When things go down, demand for safe haven assets tends to increase. Gold and silver go up. They doubled within 18 months of the crash in 2008. They're performing very, very well in this climate as well. Same thing goes with inflation, right? Everyone knows what inflation is broadly. It's when things become more expensive with time. The definition of inflation is actually the rising cost of commodities and services over time. Gold and silver, being commodities, tend to increase as inflation goes up. And then finally, you've got what may be our biggest issue longer term, and this is devaluation of the dollar. Right now, we have a world that is distancing from the dollar. Central governments around the world are clambering and buying gold. Why? Because gold and the dollar have an inverse relationship. In fact, last year was the single biggest year for gold buying by central governments in history. So the world right now is betting against the dollar, and they're using gold to do it. So it's really about the climate that we're in. It's a very conducive one for safe haven assets like gold and silver.
Well, Phillip Patrick, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Hey guys, Josh Hammer here. We've got a great special for you called Breaking Bidenomics. So the Biden re-election campaign is running on so-called Bidenomics more than virtually anything else, it seems, but they're trying to sell you a very, very different vision of Bidenomics compared to what our actual reality has been living through it for the past few years. We're going to break down what Bidenomics really is. We're going to be joined by some outstanding guests who will help break it down for you, from the inflation to the deficit spending, the war on energy, all of that. And you can go ahead and download the First TV app to watch Breaking Bidenomics for free.